Hello, man. Hello, McDowell's. I hope you're all doing well today. But some of us aren't doing well. I've witnessed a lot of people aren't doing well nowadays, and that's what the topic of this. That's what I've witnessed. A lot of people aren't doing well nowadays. Okay, so I got my sound check, and we'll go on. So I hope you're all well. Hello, Chewy. Hello, MGTOW Warrior. Hello, everybody that's going to come in. I'm sorry about the noise in the background. I'm running my heater because it's really cold today, and I'm just freezing. I don't know if I'm freezing just because I'm getting off a cold and a flu, but or whatever it was. But I'm just cold, and I will have to deal with that slight humming in the background. If you can hear it, let me know if my sound filters have filtered it out. Let me know about that too. I'll turn it off if it gets too irritating. So let me know about my sound if it gets too bothersome for you. Today we're going to talk about homelessness in America. Homelessness in America is prevalent for most men in their lifetime. Well, there's a certain percentage of men, especially after divorce, after when we look at homeless, we look at from homeless stays on the out of your home for one night to 1 year, and then there's potential homelessness after a year for most people. We'll look at men. Homelessness happens to men after divorces, after separations, after breakups, after accusations. Everything that we talk about in these forums can lead to homelessness. So it's a particular subject that resonates with MGTOWs in general, and you're all good. Does the sound good, Chewy? Or is there too much background noise? The computer is one thing, and that's always humming, but the heater is another thing, and I'm just cold today, and that's it. And so today's homelessness is especially prevalent among men. They'll say the stats. They'll try to work the stats and work it this way and work it this way. And I know, working in the homeless shelters for years and years and years, the stats are taken generally from shelters and the people that sign up. That's the only way you know about these. But I can tell you right now that most men that deal with health and human services, you guys know it, and I know it, dealing with, as soon as you go into a homeless shelter, my job would be to fill out paperwork to see what kind of funding I can get from you. And that's where we're going to talk at homelessness in the sense of a social fact. If you don't know what a social fact is, go back to my video on social fact, and I'll slightly explain it. A social fact is how the government influences altruism. Here's the people in need. The government's up the middle. The money goes to the government and back down to the people. Somehow during this process, instead of going straight over, it looks like a pyramid. Instead of going straight over to the people, we can expect that a certain amount of money and certain amount of that money in proportion to what is given to the people in need from the people that are altruistic. That could include taxes and donations and homeless funds and stuff like that, and charities, will be spent by the government in that process. That's why I said that homelessness is not homelessness in spite of the government's want and desire to stop homelessness. It's caused by the government. Most homelessness is caused by the government. It's caused by the poverty. It's caused by job movements. It's caused by social economic factors. Other than that, a variety of social economic factors. Mental illness, alcoholism, drugs, and alcohol all play into this part. domestic abuse, domestic violence, and I would include males into that at a 50% rate too, that are overrepresented in homelessness. 86% of all homeless are males, and most of them are removed their house for the forspoken reasons. There's divorce, there's domestic abuse, and there's mental abuse, and with that, and usually happens with males. The blah 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 blah. She's yelling at you 24/7 until you finally leave the house and you find yourself sleeping in the car, and then you will be represented in those stats, and from 1 day to a year, or paternal homelessness over a year, which is what we will talk about today. But one of the things that made me start thinking about all these stats and everything, and I try not to think about it because it's such a sad subject that it makes me sad. And I worked in homelessness for a while, and it brings tears to my eyes when I think about some of these guys that were now in. I'm cold here today. Can you imagine being cold out in the van? I've experienced that in my life. Can you imagine being cold in a sleeping bag next to a shopping mall? It's a very sad thing. And some of those guys, when we take them in, they were shaking, and some limbs, some pieces of their fingers and toes were missing. They'll automatically qualify them as mentally ill, but I think the shock and the stress from the environmental factors, maybe losing a finger, a toe, if you leave your hand out of a sleeping bag at a sub-zero at night, you're going to lose that hand. There's a lot of stress during that, and the stressors build, and these people are represented into a mental illness category. But I think it's just post traumatic stress from the experience of being left out in the cold for the first time. So we think about a lot of these things, and not a lot of people care about it and everything. But the biggest factor. That's my frothy coffee. I made a cappuccino, and that's why I was late in, because I was finishing up my cappuccino this morning, and it's going to warm me up while I talk. But one of the factors that most leads to homelessness is lack of housing. The biggest factor of homelessness is lack of housing. Tiny homes, just Silent Sage. If we had tiny homes, if we had mass homes, if we had motel themes on homes with small rooms, homeless would almost evaporate immediately. Some of the stats that I'll give you is $2.6 million a year, a $227 million raise in money this year towards homelessness. What's the amount of that money that actually makes it to the homeless? That we talked about the social fact. Here's the money coming in, the altruism. Well, I'll call it altruism because it is altruism. It's the kind hearts of the American taxpayer. Here's the altruism. Here's the homeless. Here's the government. If it went straight over, 100% would reach the homeless. 100% would reach the homeless. But it goes to the government. Well, what's that money that trickles down after the government? You got $2.6 billion a year, which is not even in reference to what's happening now in the wall. To build a wall, it would be $5 billion, and that's not even what it's going to take. It may take it across Texas, halfway there or something, or put a wall in these. We're going to spend $5 billion. We just gave $10 billion to Venezuela and in lower Mexico, so they can as a gift, I guess you would call it, a gift from the taxpayers of so that was double the amount of the wall. In perspective to the wall that they want, we give $2.6 billion to homeless. Now, out of that $2.6 billion, $776 million actually is what's actually dispersed to the actual homeless. So what happens to almost $1.9 billion? That's where a social fact comes in. That's the cost of employment. That's what I call Sally Struthers effect. Sally Struthers sitting out in the desert, fat ass Sally Struthers sitting out in the desert, eating up the food that never gets to the Ethiopians. That was the picture in South Park when social fact was relevant a few years ago. A social fact is it costs about 3 times the amount that's ever going to 3 to 4 to 5 times the amount that's going to reach the homeless to run the actual program, instead of minimalizing these programs, putting them through libraries or existing post offices. If you're homeless, I always thought that the perfect place to run a program, a nonprofit, but these things get ate up by most of the money that goes for homeless is going to get ate up by nonprofits, and these nonprofits will represent themselves through grants, and we write grants for these things, and we have to use terminology in those grants, which is we're going to help with drug abuse. We're going to help with alcohol abuse. We're going to help with domestic violence. And those are the big 3 that you're going to get funding for. If you do not mention those big 3 in your writing, the chances of getting one of those $5 million grants to start a home, and I've had the $5 million grant to start the homes, you won't be able to get it. And then it gets immediately pulled after that, because these grants don't generally come from the United States government. They go to grantors, and the grantors get control over the grants. You can see the Cleveland Foundation, plus the government gives it to the grantors, and they pick the winners and losers. That's why a social fact is relevant in these things. And then these people, A1 administrators, start scraping their CEO fees off of that, and then actually 1/5 of the money will actually get to the people that it goes to. And that's a sad fact about a social fact in homelessness in America, when we have over 800,000. I looked at the ad today. If you look and you type in homelessness, Google, you'll see U.S. homeless population grows for the first time in 7 years. They'll do 3 articles. One of them is 10 minutes in homelessness, and a look at homelessness in America. But the interesting one is the homeless rate is starting to grow now. Now we can see that we can see in these national estimates and everything that they do that they'll identify 50 to 450,000 people as homeless every night. But the true measure of homelessness down in the low bar is what I put it at 7.4 million families and people every year. And I'll read that out for you so you understand what they're saying. The National Law Center for Homeless Poverty current estimated each year there's 2.5 to 3.5 million Americans that sleep in shelters. That's where I said the transition to shelters and everything to count these people, and that's what we do. We count them. We run GIPRAs. We do that. We count them, and so transitional housing in public places not meant for human habitation. At least 7.4. This is the interesting part here. At least 7.4 million every year. Go back to the every year, because we're talking about every year, have lost their homes and are doubling up with others. What does it mean? What does it mean when they say someone, that means that someone had a home and lost their home? What are the reasons you lose a home? You lose a home because you lost your job. Current job movement in America. This has always been an astounding fact that they go over, that I've tried to push through with no success, because nobody wants to hear this. Corporate America and the government makes people homeless. How do they do that? Job movement. You get a job like you'll bring Moen Fawcett or Ridge Tool or Ford or GM into an area like this. The area grows, and this is where I say it'll start resembling what is called back in the 1920s and 30s the company store. Now, all you guys know what the company store is. The company buys up the property around the company, puts houses up, puts supermarkets up. They get you in debt to the company. They'll sell you a house at a large rate. The company owns the house. Then the company picks up and moves, or they shut down, or they lay off. And then they reclaim all those loans. And then in the 30s and 40s, they reclaim all those loans and they call back all the debt and they say, you can work for us to pay your loan off. And that's when you're working under servient laws. You're working as a slave then. In that process, we made that illegal. But in the process that goes around now, when companies often move around the country, you get let's just say let's just say a country, let's say L'Oreal. We had this with L'Oreal recently in an area that was well populated and a nice area. The company paid a good amount of money. It was $65,000 plus a year. The employees were making good, but this is what happens in most companies. And L'Oreal picked up and they had 2,800 employees. We can look at SK Wellman. We can look at what are some of the other examples? Ridge 2, like I said. We can look at Ford and GM do this often. And mostly steel mills like up the street here that are totally closed, which used to employ 30,000 people. Now we start thinking about the social fact in this. We start thinking about the company store. There's 3 or 4 different branches which you have to start looking at homelessness in. And it all goes back to the company store policies that we have running in the United States, which causes homelessness, which forces homelessness, which makes homelessness into a business. And that's where I'm going to go today with this thing. And then our government, that's our government doing things that make this into a business. Now you look at corporations and tax cuts and it's from state to state and everything. Let's take, for instance, we'll take L'Oreal. L'Oreal was in Ohio here and employing 2,800 people or something like that. What happened is after 15, 20 years here and making they used to make a couple products, the Matrix products or the Matrix, and they were popular products during the 90s and 80s, and they picked up and they left and they went where? Where did they go? Does anybody know? Well, they went to Kentucky. You know why they went to Kentucky? Because Kentucky offered them a tax break. So 2,800 people that had mortgages and in that area were homeless pretty much. They're going to lose their mortgage. There's no way to pay their mortgage. Now this happens with companies all the time because of the government's inability to regulate and say, hey. Now, Germany has a few laws, which I talk about, that if you leave, but you're going to leave, but you're going to leave everything there. And somebody else is going to start, because you just can't up and move and leave 2,800 people short on their mortgages. Now, when we look at the shutdown right now, what's the big argument for the shutdown? Oh, these people are going through an amount of human suffering and everything. But American workers know this, and I've been laid off twice, and job has exited and moved twice, and in my history, and long layoffs and 3 months layoffs, and short 3 months layoffs are short. Them are vacation layoffs. I told them I used to get those every other year, where you get a 3 months layoff and you just save your money and you got a vacation layoff. But the ones that are extended up to a year and a half, where you're looking for jobs and stuff like that, and the company shuts down, well, the ability to pay your mortgage. Now we look at the complaints of these, what they're complaining about over a $5 billion wall right now is you got 800,000 workers complaining that they can't pay their mortgages right now. In a single month, they can't pay their mortgage, which is ridiculous, because I've been through this several times. You should have. The average, now we can look at the stats in this. The average government employee makes $83,000 to $102,000, somewhere in that range. It may range down to $74,000 in states like Kentucky or Missouri and everything, but the average is $83,000 a year. And we look at Dayton, Ohio, where they average the $84,700 for a government worker, and then right above it you can look and you can see that the average worker and Dayton, Ohio makes $47,000 a year. So they double the amount of average, the average worker that pays a mortgage like you or I. That's for anywhere that ranges from an electrician to a plumber to a factory worker to a normal person. But your government worker will double your pay, and that's coming out of your taxes. So after 3 weeks, we're looking at potential mortgages, foreclosures, and stuff, which is ridiculous. But what caught my eye, interesting, and what started this whole thing is when I was looking over the what will this affect in our communities. One of the things that will affect is a direct link from home mortgages to recipients of home mortgages with Freddie Mac, and all those things, and in the way the housing market works. And this is why I'll say we live in a feudal system here. We don't really live in a democracy. That's long ago. We are a capitalist, and even when you say capitalism, it kind of bothers me, because we live in a feudal system now that bases itself on houses. We could see from the housing collapse has almost destroyed our economy a few years ago. What the leading factor of our economy was, it's housing. And who owns those houses? Well, I'll tell you what, in an average house like this, even though this house is paid off, I still pay taxes on it. In your lifetime, if you own a house, you're going to pay it off once, and an average house like this would cost you about $72,000 on the market. You're going to pay $142,000 to $146,000 to Uncle Sam in taxes. So that's 3 times the cost of the house. You're going to get points on your mortgage, and then when you pay off your mortgage, there's going to be interest. There's going to be another time and a half after that. So 5.5 times the price of your house, 5.5, I don't know how to make a half with my fingers, will 4.5 times the price of your house goes to somebody else. It goes to the government. It goes in taxes. It goes to we have these two competing systems in the United States that are competing for the money from home mortgages and the loans. And one's Uncle Sam, and he gets Uncle Sam always gets the lion's cut of everything. So 3.5, generally 3.5 times every one of your guys' house, if you take a mortgage, is going to go to Uncle Sam, which seems ridiculous at a point where in 1952, between the dates of 1952 and 1920, when we were deciding on land taxes and stuff like that, I think this would come after the New Deal. We decided that some states were going to pay land taxes and some states were going to pay food taxes. And in Ohio, we said, well, we're going to pay land taxes. And then they were very cheap at that time. And then he says, we won't pay the food taxes. But then the government came in from the back door, increased the amount of inflation through taxing the producer at the back end of that. And then the producer of the food, in this creepy little deals that they have with the government, slap that on the price of food. You've seen those increases in the last 10, 12 years. Like an avocado used to be 50 cents, and now it's 80 cents and 99 cents, and $1, sometimes up to $1.20 for an avocado. You wonder where those excess. It wasn't that these prices are cost more in Chile to pick an avocado. It's that Uncle Sam slipped in the back door on those things and started taxing. And then the producer said, well, I'll just raise the price of the distributor just said, well, I'll just raise all the price of. Now you got to wonder, it goes through a distributor, a trucking system, a logistics system, and it goes through the actual owner of the store or supermarket, which is generally that. So they've added that to, after agreeing back in that day that, and especially here in Ohio, that they weren't going to gouge you on your food prices as long as you paid. Now we're paying both of them, and they've lied to us, and they broke the deal, is what I'm saying. Now, when we look at that in conjunction to the increase in homelessness in the United States, and now we're arguing about silly things like a wall, and we get we actually argue about giving $2.6 billion, which is nothing out of a $4.5 trillion budget in America, to homeless people, and they give them a mere $225 million raise this year, which is going to go and get sucked up by what I talked about in the social fact. The government people are going to eat that up in their raises and and this becomes a problem, and it becomes a problem for the homeless people. And I know that was a long way to take around, so we start understanding the dire nature of our government's relationship, the houses, and homelessness. And when you put it in a MGTOW point of view with domestic violence, we're talking about, and we start looking at things like false accusation, and we start looking at things like after divorce, and we start looking at all those precursors that come before homelessness to a man 99 to 90% of the time. It's well, I wouldn't say 99. I would say probably about 45 to 50 to 65% of the time it's going to be divorce that's going to leave a man homeless. That's when most of the men that I've heard about homeless, and I've heard of thousands of stories in my lifetime, and it all was, there was a girl. It all starts with, there was a girl, and now she gets my pay. And poverty leads to homelessness, lack of proper shelter, and it's never lack of proper shelter. We have enough shelters in the United States to shelter everybody in the United States plus 15% more of any population that wants to come in. So it's never a lack of shelter. If you hear about that, it's a lack of shelters, that's a flat out lie. Where does most of the funding for the homeless go? Well, it goes to the stat on 36%, and they'll give you a stat of 36% of females that are homeless because of domestic violence. Yes, because it's well instituted, because they go immediately into shelters, and these are really nice shelters. Some of the guys that are out in the street would look at this and go, Jesus. That's a representation of 36%, they say. Why is that a representation of 36%? Only simply because they can count those numbers in more frequency. If someone comes into, you already got their information, you got their number, you add those numbers too. It's really hard to go count a number from a homeless guy sleeping under the bridge that can't go to Health and Human Services, because the first thing they're going to do is put him in jail because he's back on his child support. And I'll say that again so you guys understand this rate. Most homeless men end up homeless after these divorces and everything. They can't go to Health and Human Services or HUD and apply, because the first thing that's going to happen is the sheriff at the door is going to go and arrest them, and he's going to be put in jail for not paying his child support because he's homeless, because he can't pay his child support, because of incidences like company movement. Maybe it just got too hard working 2 jobs. Maybe he got disabled. Maybe the mental stress of living on the streets got to him. I don't care what the reasons are. I know the causes. And it becomes a sad thing when you start looking at these things, and you start realizing it's always nice. I always say there's 2 kinds of people in this world, and I represented it in a story a lot. And you got to get the analogy of the story. Most people will never have to look at it. Most people are they're vacant in their mind with what homelessness looks like. That's because they don't want to look at it. Me and my friend were driving down the road one day, and there was a couple homeless guys, and I see the blankets, and you all see this, the blankets in the little cardboard boxes, and the abundance of clothes that's usually around, which make up mattresses. And I said, stop, I want to do something about it. Man, I don't want to see that no more. So I said, stop, and I'll give him $5 or give him $20 or something. My buddy says, yeah, I'm going to call the mayor and I'm going to make it stop because I don't want to see that. So we were saying the same thing. I don't want to see it and I want to help. He said, I don't want to see it and I'm going to get rid of it by force, and the police will come down in Detroit. And if you lived in Detroit or Cleveland or any of the major cities, the police will come down and they will remove them, and they will stomp out their tents, and they will. And so the good citizens, so the people that don't want to see it, don't have to see it, and they'll pretend that's a cure for it. And that's just another violent act portrayed on men in America, where we are disposable, and it's just another violent act that piled on top of all the other violent acts that get piled on us men, and usually end up crushing us men. Now we can look at the suicide rate during these things, and the suicide rate of homeless males is well above 54%. Whether they kill themselves immediately or whether it takes a little while, and I was going to look up the actual suicide rate, but in America today, if any guys happen to know it for this year, just write it down there. And when you look at these things, company movement, and you look at taxes, and you look at predatory capitalism, and you look at all these things that the government can control and does control inside of this country, and then you look at the suicide rate of males, they all seem to look very similarly linked, like there's a pruning process, like there's a process. Okay, you lose your job, you don't get back on your feet, you don't man up, and guess what? You're going to live on the street and you're going to kill yourself, and I'm going to force that. And that in itself, I would consider as not suicide. I would consider that as murder. Where the government murders large portions of the society every year. Every time you see a male or hear of, and they don't put it in the paper no more. They stop putting it in the paper because they don't want all the good people to see those stories about the bum down the street freezing in the snow, about the guy that had his gas and electric turned off by the landlord that took his houses, because the government took his house and sold it to the landlord, and because he was back on his taxes, and he turned off his gas and electric here in Ohio. That we had one of those incidents up around here, in an infamous case on a little street that around the corner that has creepy vibes now. And his name just happened to be Joe too, and they froze him to death. They turned his gas off in the middle of the winter, and they froze him to death, and they murdered him essentially. Because he refused to be homeless. They said, oh, you refuse to be homeless? And well, we'll murder you. And that's what happens in America. America business, and the private sector and the business sector has this creepy handshake, this alliance, this gentle alliance in America, where they're not gonna say they do that, but they do. And they both they both pat each other on the back, tell each other how good they're doing, and they provide for each other. And then we start talking about people in the good people, and the people that are in the government, the people that run the government, and the people that are in the know, and all those people. And lately there's been some words shuffled around our government. Because of this disturbing layoff that we have in the government, and I will call it a layoff. I'm not going to call it a shutdown. I'm just calling it a layoff, because now they're experiencing what every other American has experienced in his life. Welcome to the real world, I say. It's like putting a Band-Aid on a skull fracture. Yeah, $2.6 million, $2.6 billion, like putting a Band-Aid on a skull fracture. But in this whole process, the sad part is the government manufactures more poverty and more, and that's what I always say. A social fact is, an HHS In 1972, poverty dropped below 8%. When poverty drops below 11%, I think it dropped down to 7.2%, and that just happens to be the year that the ERA started in existence, and Health and Human Services changed forever. There's reasons why. Health and Human Services, they look at, and I talked about this a little yesterday, and it bothered me when I seen an article where the governor or whoever was speaking of revenues taken in like this, so something they earned. They didn't earn it; they stole it. They stole it from the American people. Health and Human Services is another good example of that. If poverty drops below 11%, you know what they have to do? They have to lay people off. Yeah, there was a large layoff in Health and Human Service. You can go back and watch some of the Archie Bunker episodes with his son-in-law and his son-in-law work for Health and Human, and there was layoffs, and Archie has some episodes in there. You can see there was a large layoff, and this is not something, but they had to start laying off government workers, so they devised a plan. The early Equal Rights Amendment devised a plan that has something a lot to do with no-fault divorce. They put in no-fault divorce immediately after 1972. Guess what happened? Yeah, poverty raised back up to 14%. It's a viable entity now. You don't have to lay off. We're doing good now, they thought, because government workers often look at this from the wrong side of the spectrum. They're looking at revenues as they earned it. They're doing a job, and they're looking like, we made a product, and our product was poverty. And these people that are experiencing that product of poverty and stress right now are coming to see us, where we can hand them portions of the money that they're overtaxed on back to them and then shame them. And that makes us feel good because now we have a job. That's that social fact that I was talking about, where the government skims off most of that money, and they just look like fat-ass Sally Fields out in the desert eating all the food like Jabba the Hutt, and the food never gets to the Ethiopians. That was the South Park representation of a social fact. You can look up Durkheim's representation of a social fact, and he'll tell you that these things all boil down to one thing, and this social fact leads to one thing. And his analogy on that is the same as my analogy on that. It's going to lead to homelessness. It's going to lead to male suicide. And then we can start measuring these male suicide by social. And when the only way we can measure these things is sociology. We can look at how systems work together. We can look at how these things, what makes the stress factors. Was the stress too high? Was the stress too low? Was there environmental causes in these things? Were these people committing suicide because of good reasons? Like, I didn't want to stress my family. I didn't want to be a burden on society, and they committed suicide. So everything leads down to that, and homelessness is just a part of forcing suicide on men, so they can prune the men out of the society that they deemed not worthy because of the crime of making a girl unhappy, or the crime of not being able to pay their mortgage, which incidentally, as I said, the mortgages are 4.5 times too high because the government has decided that 3.5 times 3.5 times what you will pay in a lifetime for your house goes to them and some other guy that he chose as the winner. Now that's when we start talking about what Marx talked about with the proletariat and the burgess, and the argument between the proletariat and the burgess. And this pretty much sums it up nicely, because back then we had the same kind of government. They had the same kind of government. It was a feudal government where they had few rich people that ran the farms and let you exist. and they had to do something about this. Now, if we take a look at feminism and we take a look at the modern movements and the modern movements within the millennials right now, you see the millennials, most of them don't believe in capitalism anymore. Most of them are leaning towards socialism, progressivism, and this thing is going to start gaining speed. And there's reasons for this. And Marx explained all this stuff to us, why these things will happen. I think homelessness filters in that. I think male suicide, all these things that we talk about in MGTOW, and I'll say all the time, all roads lead back to MGTOW. All roads. And then Marx talked about, he didn't have the word feminism in his vocabulary, but he talked about a congregation of women that was going to form if this happens, if we let these feudal lords get out of control. And then these problems, and he'll talk about the Burgess, the proletariat often talk about homes and housing and why this is important and how this works in to this thing that happens, and it seems to circulate in countries like Russia and America, and we see civil war and strife, and we see a lot of things that are happening. And Marx was just, don't kill the messenger. He was just a messenger at that point. He prognosticated what was going to happen, and and Marx himself was anti-hypocritical about these things. He wasn't going to take a hypocritical stand on that, and he hated hypocrisy. And he just told you, and a lot of people blame it on here, and I call that's the blame it on the maintenance man effect. Yeah, if you guys know, if you've ever been a maintenance man, and you're a maintenance man in a company, what a lot of people will do is they'll call you to fix something, and then they'll blame you for breaking it. They'll go, "Oh man, that was, it was just not acting." And you get this in apartment centers and everything. We call blame it on the maintenance man, and that thing happens. That's another I put in Joe's paradoxes, which are just paradoxes of human behavior. It's blame it on the maintenance man, but the government does that, and it becomes also it becomes just a big turbulent amount of absurdity in our lives if you're a MGTOW and you were looking at all these social stages and social facts and social events that are happening now and going, wow, man, these people are really retarded. They are. But we can see these things happening, and now we're arguing over a $5.5 billion wall while we look at, and they're going to proclaim. And the thing that bothered me about this is they might go and proclaim a national emergency and build that wall, when the real national emergency is homelessness in the United States, which they're only giving $2.6 billion to, and only 776 million actually make it to the homeless. And they're just because of, well, like I said, the social fact, and a lot of that money probably goes, there's going to be $222 billion actually spent, but a lot of that money is for loans in, I don't know what sector of time, it's like a 10-year time sector or something, but a lot of those monies are giving to loans like our president. What did his father do for a living? His father made most of his money building low-cost housing in New York. That he got the money from, where did he get that money? He got it from me and you. He got it from that $222 billion that me and you give the government, and they give back to these builders and these, and they're not really the proletariat. They will say, "Oh, we're doing such a great job." No, these are just the contractors and the builders that were lucky enough to be chosen by our government as the winners. I didn't look about how many of the homeless were illegal or aliens. I don't. to be counted, you would have to have some kind of ID, and that's the problem. You have to go through the Health and Human Service system, and if you were an illegal alien, your name would be connected through the Health and Human Service, and they would call ICE, and ICE would pick you up. So the idea that these people are illegal aliens is no, that doesn't fly, because you have to have a social security number. To get any kind of housing or shelter, you're going to have to give up information. As soon as your information is given up, you're immediately red flagged. But that's the same problem for men in this. We don't want to shift the paradigm here to some fake paradigm where we're worried about illegal aliens. The problem here is men like me and you that would end up in those situations can't go to the systems, because once you stop paying your child support, or once you stop, or if you do have a felony or something, there's going to be a sheriff right there that's going to put you in jail. But that is an interesting concept too. We talk about we talk about all these illegal aliens, and what I say is the whole caravan that came up of 4,000 people, you could have came and dropped them in my small county here. You could have picked them all up, dropped them in our small county here. They would have blended into the county, and no one would ever notice them. So it's what? It's a diversion. It's a distraction. This is all a diversion, a distraction to the real problems in America. What are the real problems in America? Low pay, homelessness. We have violence. We have military men with PTSD, and this ever-funding war that we got, ever-funded war that we got. We got the military industrial complexes. We got establishment, professional politicians that are in fact that middle, that center in the social fact. Them are the guys getting all the money. Them are the guys making billions. There was an interesting fact on presidential candidate that most Clevelanders know. An interesting fact on presidential candidate Dennis Kucinich when he ran for he ran for the president's position back 10 years ago. I don't know if you guys remember Dennis. Dennis was an interesting character. Well, we all knew Dennis, and we all knew the simple fact that Dennis had never worked a day in his life. He was a career politician that now is worth 100, 200, 300, 400, 500, 700 million dollars. So how do you go from a guy that's never worked a day in your life to career politician having $700 million in your bank account? Well, yeah, you can all imagine what that is, how that works. So I think the bigger social fact is the corruption that goes on in our society. I think it has a lot to do with election funding and all them things. But for me today, what I want to talk about is the correlations between a government shutdown, homelessness, the social fact, and MGTOW. Because it is important, because we have to look at these things. And I think I explained it pretty good. Where are we at in this thing? Yeah, I think if there is a national emergency in America, it's homelessness, it's poverty. And until we fix those things, we can't really worry about a lot of other things. And in America, we should stop worrying about the rest of the world. And when we can say that homelessness and poverty is wiped out in America, and that would take 1 year at my estimates. If all the money for taxes and tariffs and all that went back into society, we could actually raise every American's. I figured it out one day, and it was every American could be, if you're close to poverty or you're close to homeless, could be given. There's another interesting fact I want to share with you on homelessness. Every American could be given $17,352, I think it was, to get them out homelessness or out of poverty and everything. But most Americans don't need that, so that puts the money back in the Fed. And the people that actually need it, it becomes an obscene amount of money that they have to spend, and that's where we get all the corruption at. Now, the average foreclosure in America is probably a foreclosure for about $14,000. A house will foreclose, and then $14,000 in back taxes, $14,000 in debt and it goes about a year into foreclosure and that stuff. Most of these people, like I say in the low bar there, read the low bar and consider what I said. The 7.4 million people that lost their houses last year due to foreclosure and loss of job and all those things. Most of these people will end up in the system. But when you think about the simple fact that a person that ends up in the system as a homeless person for the extended period of 1 year cost the government $35,000, $35,745, as a matter of fact. They lost their house for $14,000. Some rich banker gets the house and gets to resell it, and that adds to the corporate wealth of America. Now we see this reflect itself as the stock market steadily goes up, and we're sitting at about 75, 25 to 26 in the Dow right now. It floats in between 24 to 26 up to 27, and in a society that is really doing better than it's ever done before. But the poverty rate and the homeless rate is going down, and in correlation to what I just said, where the bankers in the feudal system end up with these houses for resale so they can make money off of them, and these houses keep going. Now you take into account why these houses it's going to cost you $35,000 to put that family that they just kicked out for $14,000. About half of that, about a half of that, it's going to cost the total taxpayer that amount of money, plus the business people get to recirculate that house, and they live on that. And we got these on the one end. We're competing with these business entities that are just raping the American people on these things. And some people, oh, they have right to make money too. No, you don't have no right to make money in those situations on foreclosures and pain and human suffering. But that's what our system relies on. And Uncle Sam will add to that problem, and that's why I say most of the problem in this country are caused by Uncle Sam. It's caused by social facts, not in spite of the American people giving altruism and being altruistic more than any country in the world, and giving more taxes than any country in the world. We still have these problems because of greed. And them are the things we just basically have to look at. So, in essence, that local banker made a little bit of money, but it cost you $35,000 in social relief to the family he just kicked off and put on the welfare roll because companies are allowed to move. And it's the same companies that are invested in the housing market. And you start thinking about the correlation between the company store and who is the new company store. Well, that's the government. And those laws are, them laws were passed in 1920. That's highly illegal, but they just go right over it in these new terms and phrases that they use, and they rebrand themselves. And it leads to male homelessness, the things that we talk about, what we have to deal with in here. But we had a good example of that with Mayor of MGTOW running around saying he was going to help out with that thing. And this is where a social fact comes in. I'm going to help out with that thing. I'm not the guy that actually does that for a living. That's what he was saying. But I'm going to help out. And he took $17,000 to $24,000, probably up to $30,000 from the MGTOW community. And boom, he's gone. And that's what greed does. Well, what was his business? He was a real estate person. And Hollywood over there, and he showed us great pictures of him handing out candy bags to homeless. Candy bags. Can you imagine that? And we fell for it. Oh, the shame around here. If you stay around long enough at MGTOW, you will witness shame beyond your imagination. When Earl Silverman was hanging from the rafters because he had a homeless house open, but the government was ready to take it because of his taxes. And then the MRA decided to have a $35,000 party in Detroit that year, or Windsor, or wherever that was. And woo, they partied hard, but there were two things that were happening during that time. Earl Silverman was hanging from a rafter, and Measure 6 was going on in North Dakota. And look up Measure 6 in North Dakota. That has quite a lot to do with 50-50 custody. And but the MRA, for those donations, were having a big old party, and it was groovy. And at that time, Mayor MGTOW was raping MGTOW for their donations. And if anybody ever got this shit together in here, I would just be like, whew, because I don't have to go through those moments of shame anymore. This is delicious. I think that's, I just got some Colombian, and I roasted it this year. Daria, we need to shrink it. Sounds like we need to destroy the government. Yeah. I don't know why, by what means. I think it's great that this layoff is happening, and I'll call it a layoff. It's not a shutdown. We're laying off unneeded workers because we're restructuring. That's a great idea. Hey, why don't every city and every state and every county in the United States start laying off workers that aren't needed, because we need a serious restructuring of our government, and you can call it a layoff. And if you've been paying into your unemployment, then go get unemployment. Because that's the way every company in America works. I know. I've been laid off half a dozen times in my life. But if you ask a government worker, like we've seen with on CNN the other day, and it's just bothered the living bejeebers out of me, as he thinks that them revenues are lost revenues. He says the government's not getting those revenues because that shows a real lack of intelligence and a real lack of, it shows real ignorance on their part, because they think they're actually making a product, and the product that they are making is called poverty and stress. And we have a saying here in Lorraine, because all of our companies have closed up and everybody's losing their homes around here in that company store that the government's running and taking people's property after they paid for it over and over and over again, and leaving these people up here homeless. We have a saying. It says, here in Lorraine, we're exporting stress. We got boxcars full of it. And we're stressing the American people further and further and further. They wonder why the average American is mad about one thing or another. What he's really mad about is his government. And I think it's great. We got to start laying them off. That's government layoffs. That's what we need. Act like any other business around here. So that's all I wanted to talk about a little bit, and I hope I gave you some interesting ideas and some interesting facts that was taken from the state of homelessness in America underneath. I'll put it up, the National Alliance to End Homelessness, and the PDF of National Alliance when I get my numbers, and you can check my facts. They all come from the National Alliance of Homelessness, and all roads lead to MGTOW. A fair tax, a shift in power in the government. Yeah, we got to get rid of all those. We got to get rid of all those people, those entitled people in the government that are making upwards over over $83,000, twice the national average, and start paying them a fair rate and fair pay, and start taxing Americans at a fair tax instead of doing these behind the deals like I explained with your food taxes, raising the price of food, hence. Hence, taxation goes up 6%. The government makes money on that as they cause the problem. And nowadays, an avocado is $1.25 to $1.50 because of, you know. And then you want to talk about poverty and people being on a welfare dole and people getting food stamps. Well, that's all caused by the government too. And maybe I'll go into that subject deeply one day. There used to be back in the early 30s and 20s in America, there was no food stamps and everything. It was called the Methodist Fund. The Methodists and the Catholics decided they were going to start taking in money and donations, and then this fund grew and they handed over. It grew to a unreasonable size for them to have in a bank account. So they estimated that unreasonable size should take and feed every American up to 2031, and the government got a hold of that fund and they put it into food stamps, which became food stamps, not these EBT debit cards we got now. And they started doing the same thing that they always do, a social fact. They started eating the fund. Greedy people started eating the fund after we had paid for that up to 2031. You can go down to your local I don't know if you have a Cleveland Foundation like we have a Cleveland Foundation library and get that kind of information that they don't release to the public and see how these things actually work. But that's a topic for another day, and that's a topic that I'm pissed off about a government because, hey, fat ass Sally Struthers was sitting out in the desert eating all the food, and it never made it to the Ethiopians. And I think that's the group. I think that's the best. That was the best effigy of that problem at this point, and this still goes on, and it's called The Social Fact. If you want to watch a great movie and learn about this stuff, it's called Poverty Incorporated. Get Poverty Incorporated. You can steal it online or watch it on YouTube or whatever you're doing, and watch it and see how poverty is manufactured by the government. And that's all I got to say today. We argue about things like the wall, and we argue about homosexual candidates being inducted to Congress, and we've seen the awful event the other day with Pence having to swear in that girl, which is being snarky and everything. And these minute things, they divert us from the real questions, the real national emergencies. And the real national emergencies in America and in the world is climate change, it's poverty, it's homelessness. And unless we address those things, everything else looks ridiculous to me. And all roads lead back to MGTOW. MGTOW can end a lot of this stuff. We just got to keep grouping together, keep being reasonable in our thoughts, and just keep being MGTOW. Well, man, that's about it. And I'm going to take off and do my Saturday and have a great day. And most of all, man, thanks a lot for being MGTOW. MGTOW.